Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. It's my 5th trip to Lithuania. I don't know if that must be a lot for an American. Maybe I can even get citizenship, because when America becomes a collapsing welfare state like Greece, I need to find some place to go. But let me go ahead and jump right into my presentation. I want to talk first, before I even get to youth unemployment, I want to give a little economics lesson. Now, in theory, this shouldn't be necessary, but I find when I talk to American politicians, they need some remedial economics. So I want to put everyone here on the same page. What gives us economic growth? What is economic growth? It's producing more things. Well, how do you get more things? There are only 2 factors of production. It doesn't, even if you're a Marxist economist, you agree that there are 2 factors of production, labor and capital. So the only way you get more economic growth is by either figuring out how to get more labor in your economy, more capital in your economy, or to use labor and capital more efficiently. Period. No other way. Economic growth doesn't float down from heaven. It doesn't come from Brussels. It comes from somehow figuring out how to use labor and capital in your economy. They're the ingredients. And if you want more economic growth, you need to mix those ingredients together. You need a chef. It's sort of like you're going to make dinner. You want someone to put those ingredients together to make a dinner. And what kind of chef do you want? This is sort of the fundamental question. I don't know if you recognize the Three Stooges or Dumb and Dumber. Those are American cultural icons. But if you have politicians mixing the ingredients of labor and capital together, you tend not to get very good results. Whereas if you have private market forces mixing labor and capital together, you get better results. Not because the private sector doesn't make mistakes. The private sector makes mistakes all the time. But in the private sector, there's a feedback mechanism. If you make mistakes, if you lose money, if you make poor investments, you instantly feel it in your bottom line. So there's a big incentive to try to learn from your mistakes as quickly as possible. But when government makes mistakes, there's no bottom line incentive to fix them. As a matter of fact, if you're in a government bureaucracy, you make a mistake, you say, oh, look, I need a bigger budget. So you get rewarded for making mistakes. And why does all this matter? Why do we care about economic growth? Well, here's a very simple chart showing that if you have only 1% growth, if you're like Italy, although they actually, for all this century, have had 0% growth, but if you have 1% growth, it takes you 70 years to double your GDP. On the other hand, if you have 4, 5, 6, or 7% growth, we heard earlier about Singapore and Hong Kong. If you grow like Singapore and Hong Kong, you double your GDP in between 10 and 20 years. And the Baltic countries, like Lithuania, had a very good, strong period of economic growth last decade. Now, of course, the financial crisis hit the Baltics hard, but at least unlike some of the southern European economies, the politicians here actually did cut spending. And that's a very admirable thing, and I think that's why growth has been resumed in the Baltics where it hasn't in Southern Europe. So let's now talk about, with this sort of common frame of reference about the importance of growth and what causes growth, let's just talk about the libertarian vision of capitalism, system of limited government and competition, and let's compare that to sort of the socialist model. Although technically, there's not even a socialist model anymore. Because what is socialism? It's technically the government ownership of the means of production. And for the most part, politicians aren't talking about that anymore. They want to control the private sector, but they don't actually want to own the private sector. So in reality, we're not talking about capitalism versus socialism. We're really more talking about capitalism versus statism or corporatism. Yes, you have nominal private ownership, but you have government trying to control through regulation the private sector, and of course you have high tax rates to finance a big welfare state. So you have redistribution, you have statism, you have corporatism, but we don't maybe Cuba and North Korea, but for the most part, we don't have the pure socialist model anymore. We have indirect socialism. So now let's talk about job creation. And frankly, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about youth unemployment or adult unemployment. The issues are exactly the same. The most important thing you need to understand is that nobody in the private sector creates a job unless what? Unless they actually think a worker is going to produce more revenue than they cost. I mean, if you open up a restaurant, Are you going to hire someone for your restaurant if you think that they're going to cost you, 30,000 litas and they're only going to bring in 20,000 litas? No, of course not. You hire new workers because you think as an entrepreneur, as a business owner, you hire new workers because you think they're going to bring in this much money and they're going to cost this much money. Now let's think about it. Cost this much money. What increases the cost of hiring a worker? What increases the cost of hiring a worker is taxation, regulation, mandates, liabilities. I mean, one of the most frustrating things about Europe, maybe not here in the Baltics, but in other European countries, when people say, oh, we care about workers. And I say, how do you care about workers? Oh, well, we make it so that it's very hard to fire workers. And I say, but if you make it very hard to fire workers, what are you telling employers? You're telling employers to be very careful not to hire them in the first place. Oh, we care about workers. Look at all these government benefits we give them. Well, those government benefits are financed by high social insurance taxes, and those high social insurance taxes increase the cost of hiring workers. In other words, in the real world, it doesn't matter whether you have good intentions. What matters is the bottom line, everything that you do as a government official, as a politician, as a regulator, as a bureaucrat, everything you're doing with taxes and regulations and mandates and legal costs, all those things that you're doing are actually increasing the cost of hiring workers. Now, some people say, okay, maybe that's true, but certainly when the economy's weak, shouldn't the government go out and spend a lot of money to create jobs programs? Wouldn't that be a good idea? And we certainly saw that in the United States. We had Bush's so-called stimulus in 2008, and then we had Obama's so-called stimulus in 2009, and in both cases they said the government's going to spend money, and the government's going to hire people, and they're then going to be employed. Isn't that wonderful? And it's wonderful, yes, I agree, assuming that you keep your eyes only open a little bit. Because if your eyes are only open a little bit, you will in effect be tricked in the way that Frederick Bastiat talked about the difference between the seen and the unseen. Because when the government spends a lot of money, and let's say it's paying a bunch of people to dig holes and fill them back in again, we can see that. Oh, and the politician's going to have what we call a ribbon cutting ceremony. Look at this. We had this program, and 100 people are now digging holes and filling them back in again. They now have jobs. But what we need to do is look at the unseen. If all the money that the government is spending to create these supposed jobs, what if that money had been left in the private sector? What if that money had been left in the private sector? It might have been used to create twice as many jobs. And so what you need to do is analyze and investigate, to the extent that some governments are very big and some are very small, which ones do a better job of creating employment. And the evidence is that small government economies with free markets do a much, much better job. The same thing is true on issues such as redistribution. One thing that it's very frustrating in the US, we've had this big debate about unemployment insurance, where every couple of months the politicians say we need to extend unemployment insurance because these people don't have jobs. Well, one of the reasons they don't have jobs is because there's very clear academic evidence that when you pay people not to work, what are they likely to do? They're much more likely not to work. And so unemployment insurance programs actually have a very perverse effect. And this right here is a chart. It's much too complicated to actually explain in the short period of time we have. But it basically shows that with all the redistribution programs in the federal government, this was put together by the Pennsylvania Secretary of Public Welfare. If you earn $29,000 in the United States, you're actually better off not earning income all the way up to about $69,000 a year. In other words, because as you work more, the government taxes you, but then it's not only taxing you, it's taking away some of the different handout programs it gives you, your living standards are actually higher at $29,000 of earnings than at, say, $50,000 or $60,000 of earnings. In other words, it's not just the official marginal tax rate of the income tax. It's not only the official marginal tax rate of the income tax and the payroll tax, it's also the implicit marginal tax rate of all these government handout programs that, in effect, when they take away those benefits as your income goes up, that's an implicit marginal tax rate. and it's shown right here. They call it the welfare cliff in the United States. You have no incentive to work harder to improve your living standards because you're not getting any better off. That's one of the dangerous effects of not only the tax side of fiscal policy, but also the spending side of fiscal policy. Here's something that I found from the United Kingdom. They have the same thing. Again, very complicated chart. All you need to understand is that for certain levels of income, your implicit marginal tax rate is 100%. As your income rises, it's still 95%. And then even when you sort of get out of some of the government programs, your implicit marginal tax rate is still 70%. Now, who's going to work harder? Who's going to want to supply more labor to the market? Who's going to want to be more productive when the government isn't letting you get ahead? It's like you're on one of those treadmills, but the treadmill runs faster than you do. So the harder and harder you run, you go backwards, not forwards. Redistribution is a way of trapping people in low income, not a way of making them better off. And here's a couple of cartoons we had an intern at the Cato Institute from Italy who was a very good artist. And I had her draw two cartoons that I think sort of summarize what this entire issue of the roadshow is all about. We're really talking about the welfare state, and this is how the welfare state begins. The welfare state begins for what sounds like a very noble reason. Let's say this room is society, and all of us in this room are going to get together because we know our friend Richard Ron, he broke his leg. He only has one eye, so he trips a lot. So he breaks his leg. And we're all going to say, hey, why don't we all chip in a little bit of money and we'll take care of Richard's leg for him. And because we're all good people, I mean, Tom Palmer didn't contribute, but the rest of us all contributed, and we all contributed some money, we fixed Richard's leg because we're good people. And someone says, well, why don't we actually sort of do this officially through something called the government? And we'll all agree to chip in a little bit of money at the beginning of the year. The government will have this pile of money, and when someone breaks their leg, that program will take care of them. And that's how the welfare state begins. Lots and lots of taxpayers pulling the wagon, and only a small handful of genuinely needy people riding in the wagon. But what happens over time? What happens as politicians figure out how to use that system to buy votes? What happens as people figure out that they can climb in the wagon because life is easier for them? All of a sudden, the wagon turns into a party bus, and the number of taxpayers pulling the wagon shrinks, and you have all these people riding in the wagon. This is a picture of Greece. When you add together the people in Greece who are working for the government, although no one's actually working, employed by the government, you add up all the people employed by the government, you add them to the people who are retired on the government, and my favorite story there is if you work in a hazardous profession in Greece, like hairdressing, you can retire as early as age 48. Then you add them to all the people getting welfare and disability checks, and my favorite story there is the guy who got a €700 a month disability payment for blindness, and he worked off the books as a tour guide for bird watchers. So you add up all those three groups of people in Greece, you have a majority of the voting age population. This is where the welfare state collapses. How on earth can Greece reform itself when a majority of voters are riding in the wagon? Now, in theory, they should all accept the fact that they should back away from the trough because it's collapsing. If you're a flea or a tick, it doesn't do you any good if the dog that you're on dies. But there's a tragedy of the commons issue. All the different interest groups in Greece don't want to back away from the trough because they figure that someone else will just come in and get their spot and get a bigger slice of the pie. Let me close by showing this chart from the United States, again, showing why the welfare state just doesn't work, even if your intentions are good. Our poverty rate over time was falling and falling and falling. And then, in the mid-1960s, President Lyndon Johnson decided to declare war on poverty. And since that time, we have spent trillions of dollars. And what's happened? Instead of falling, the poverty rate stagnated. Why? For those other charts I showed you before. All these redistribution programs, in effect, create a flypaper effect, and they trap people in low incomes, they trap people in dependency. Big government doesn't work. If we want people to be productive, we want people to have better lives, the only solution is small government and private sector. And the simple way of getting small government is you have to make sure to control government spending so it grows slower than the private sector. In other words, ignore the Maastricht rules from the European Union. Those are all about deficits and debt. Those are the symptoms. The underlying disease is what matters. The underlying disease is government spending. Figure out some way to cap or limit or reduce government spending so it grows slower than the private sector. The world's a laboratory. Learn the right lesson. Hong Kong and Singapore are the role models, not what you get out of Brussels and France and Berlin and places like that. Thank you very much.